Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026.
We are recording on all the things.
Okay, awesome. Welcome to the current episode of the Housing for Huntsvillians podcast.
Hell yeah. This is episode 14, I believe. 14. Shall we restart because I said hell?
No.
All right.
Welcome to episode 14 of the hellacious and amazing Housing for Huntsvillians podcast.
Love it.
So today we are going to talk about, this is kind of a part two. It's about the Mill Creek housing development. This is the $400 million mixed use, mixed income project. It's going to be on city-owned land that will replace Butler Terrace and Johnson Towers, which represents like 300 or so units of subsidized housing, public housing, owned and managed by the Huntsville Housing Authority.
That's a pretty good bit of housing.
Yes. And so please listen to episode 9, which goes into the pitfalls of subsidized housing in general, and why it's generally better for the recipients to receive cash assistance as opposed to for the government to come in and act as landlord or to subsidize developers. And then episode 12 is more backstory. It's the first time we cover Mill Creek in particular, so that goes into the backstory on Mill Creek and
Actually, what? Oh yeah, episode 12. This is 14.
Right. And so we also talk about the radon problem at Butler Terrace and what that says about, again, why public housing is an inferior solution to the problem of housing scarcity versus cash assistance.
Yeah.
The TLDR is that people are people, and if you can't charge tenants more money, you're usually going to cut back on services. Whether you're the government or you're a private entity getting government money, like whatever the situation is, generally speaking, that's how it works. People respond to incentives. And I just wanted to share quickly that I saw this firsthand in San Francisco. First of all, with rent control. So the city passed rent control, which locked in the rents that landlords could charge tenants for every building built before, I don't know, 1965 or 73. Yeah, I think it was sometime in the 60s or 70s, which, and the fact that obviously San Francisco didn't build a lot more housing, meant that a lot of people were living in rent-controlled buildings. I lived in a rent-controlled building at one point, and landlords would often end up with buildings where it cost more to operate the building than they could bring in rent. And it created, not only were landlords very not incentivized to maintain their buildings, because especially for tenants who were under rent control and were paying well below market rates, but often they literally couldn't afford to maintain their buildings. And there was also a lot of incentive for landlords they were not legally allowed to evict tenants, unless they took them to court and proved that they weren't.
It was, from what I hear, a legal nightmare.
I don't know if it's a nightmare, but it's a process, and really not possible unless the tenant is, not paying rent or breaking the law or something like that. So landlords would harass their tenants to try to get them to leave. So they would certainly not maintain the properties, and then they would make all kinds of noise, and I don't know. I'm not even creative enough to go through. I read stories about it. I don't remember the details, but anyway, it was not a safe or healthy situation for these tenants. And in the end, rent control ends up raising average rents, which is like the whole problem you're trying to solve with rent control is that people can't afford rent. So if average rents go up,
kind of ironic.
You're not only not solving that problem, but you're exacerbating the problem. And get this, rent control disproportionately helps higher income tenants.
So literally all the things that it is not supposed to do.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So people who have higher incomes, generally speaking, don't have to move as often as people with lower incomes. And they have the bandwidth to like find the rent-controlled apartments and make sure that they don't have to leave the rent-controlled apartments and keep the rent-controlled apartments in the family. Fight the landlords when they try to make life difficult for them or evict them. So yeah, no, rent control is like an absolute fail on every... I mean, rent control has helped certain low-income people avoid eviction, but you know what helps low-income people avoid eviction every time? Low average rents. So anyway, so oh my gosh, okay. And the other thing I wanted to talk to y'all about with subsidized housing is in San Francisco, and this is one of those things that like gun to my head, I could not make this up. We had at least one quote unquote affordable housing developer. So this is a housing developer who gets money from the federal government that literally had not built any new housing in decades. And the housing they managed was unsafe. Like it was not fit for human habitation. And the money that they were getting, they weren't spending on maintaining their properties. Again, could not make this up. They spent it on running ad campaigns to oppose new housing, including subsidized housing in San Francisco.
Wow.
Yes.
So it's kind of, that reminds me of a lot of like Major Tobacco had run truth.org, which the second they were able to repurpose that campaign to attack vaping, instead of it actually being of like public benefit, basically they got to attack their only competitor. Yeah, anyway, it sounds like a very similar situation.
I don't know enough to comment, but I will say the thing about subsidized housing is it seems like a win-win-win, right? Like housing developers get money, affordable housing gets built, cheaper housing gets built. Some people who need housing, who couldn't afford it before, suddenly have housing, right? That sounds great. But it's kind of like weight loss pills on the internet. It's like, if it sounds too good to be true, it's because it is. Like it's the quick fix and it might help some people, but it does not solve the problem and it creates a lot of unintended consequences along the way. That's the thing about subsidized housing. That's the thing about public housing is it does not solve the problem of housing being too expensive on average on net. And it creates all kinds of unsafe, market distortions, these entrenched, subsidized housing developers who don't actually serve their tenants, it leads to people getting radon poisoning because housing authorities don't have the incentive structure in place to like make sure that people aren't getting poisoned by their public housing. It's not a good time. Anyway, and it's like, I'm not like, oh, we can't build any subsidized housing, but it's just like, this is just not the smart or ethical way to do this. Yeah, this is just, let's do it better than we've done it in the past. Anyway, the thing that I really want to get across in this episode is that there's a consensus among researchers, pretty much. I mean, obviously you're going to find dissenters, but very few. We're talking about the Furman Center, Greater London Authority, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the White House Council of Economic Advisors, that average housing prices rise when demand grows faster than supply. And there's a lot of economic consensus, and we have examples from the real world, from Navy Yard in DC, from Seattle. After these two cities had building booms, and then San Francisco during the pandemic had basically a population decrease, that prices fall when supply exceeds demand. So the solution to people not being able to afford housing is to build more housing relative to how many people you need to house.
It seems so simple.
So simple. And so with the Mill Creek, in 2021, there was a plan. I read it. And there were supposed to be 1,500 units that were going to replace the 300 and something units of subsidized housing. And again, this was going to be mixed income, but it was a lot of units.
Yeah.
Which is great because we are, by some estimates, 100,000 units short in Huntsville. We've imported
600.
700. 700 people. 700 people are waiting for, or on the list for public housing in Huntsville. So they qualify for public housing and they need public housing, but they don't have public housing because we don't have housing for them. This now has been reduced to 750 units.
Jeez.
Total, which means it's only a 1-for-1 replacement. So for every unit of subsidized housing they're tearing down, they're only building one replacement unit. There's no increase. Because
ultimately, while it's 750 units, like only some of them are going to be subsidized, right?
Right. And the percentage is set by, this is going to be partially funded by a neighborhood choice initiative grant. So this is a HUD grant. And unclear what percentage this grant could possibly cover. It's definitely not going to be $400 million. The city of Huntsville, I think, is going to be on the hook for $8 million operating costs every year going forward just to operate the units that they're going to replace. Again, this is no increase in net units. So anyway, for the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative grant, you have to have a certain percentage of market rate housing in your development. So if they increase the number of units, they have to increase both the number of market rate units. Well, they have to increase at least the number of market rate units. They can't just add to the number of subsidized units without also adding to market rate units. So there's that. So we went to the community input meeting 2 Thursdays ago, and they had people from Urban Strategies and Urban Design Associates, representatives, talk about what Mill Creek is going to look like and the amenities it might have. There was a lot of we would like to have, we're hoping for.
There was a scary amount of that language.
It was pretty much all that language. And I don't know, it's just if you're not paying attention, you could come away with the idea that all this is going to materialize, but in reality there's no guarantee any of it will materialize. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyway, I was like, why did the number of housing units fall? And the answer was, well, we think that the people who are going to get the housing prefer larger units. And I was like, well, what do we think the 700 people on the wait list for public housing prefer? Yeah. I don't know. I feel like they should have a say. So anyway, again, we cannot fix this problem without adequate supply. We do not have adequate supply. Literally having the number of units that we're building. The other reason that the unit number decreased is that the original plan had called for parcels adjacent to the parcel that the city owns, and the new plan is only city-owned land. However, the tallest building on the lot is only 5 stories, and the plan includes townhomes. So there's absolutely room on this parcel for way more units than have been proposed and are currently being debated. So I was like, okay, let me go through my notes. And I literally took a picture of pretty much every slide that was presented. And I'm like, where do we give public input? Because they're going to apply for the grant December 11th. And so they're still, they should be open to public input until then. Couldn't find any way to offer public input. And I'm like, was it literally just you can give input at the meeting and then they don't want to hear from anybody who didn't show up to one of the meetings?
I think they're going to have I think you can give input at the next meeting technically. I don't know if there's going to be time for them to change anything about their plan.
Why would you not have an email address?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
So I called Urban Strategies today and Urban Design Associates and left voicemails This was at 1:18 p.m. It's 8:06. I have not gotten a call back. I also, in the voicemails, I left my email address. Have gotten no response. So that doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy about how all this is going to shake out for residents. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not.
To ask, like, how do we give public input? So anyway, if you're curious about how to give public input, or you just want to call them and be like, hey, I want more units. Urban Strategies number is 314-421-4200. Urban Design Associates, their number is 412-263-5200. And if you hit extension 326, that will help you leave a voicemail for Megan O'Hara, who was the representative who actually came to the public input meeting 2 Thursdays ago. So, yeah. Anyway, just wanted to give you guys a little update on that whole thing. And once again, advocate for legalizing dense, naturally affordable housing near jobs and transit, as opposed to subsidizing it. And for the people who still can't afford cheaper market rate housing, giving them cash instead of subsidizing developers and landlords.
All right. Well, yeah, definitely hit those numbers up if you want to leave input, and we'll include all the relevant details in the show description.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. This podcast is a project of Huntsville New Liberals. Sign up for our newsletter and RSVP to our monthly happy hour at huntsvillenewliberals.com.